This is my old shop. When I first moved in and started putting everything together, I realized very quickly that I had a huge dust problem. As I was trying to build my shop from the ground up, every single time I used my miter saw, wood dust would explode into the air and all over every single surface.
Stop it!
After a bit of research, it became clear that I needed to build a special miter saw station that would house the tool with a hood and allow me to centralize my dust collection. I had quite a few of these 4x4s lying around, which I knew would be perfect and strong. After cutting them down to size, I pulled out a 4x8 sheet of plywood to start cutting my surfaces. My first shop had no windows and no ventilation, so tackling my dust issue at the very beginning was paramount. After cutting all of my lumber, I started by making the tops of the tables that the miter saw would sit just underneath. For added strength, I decided to cut into the 4x4s where the bottom shelf would sit. I used some of the cutoffs from the plywood to get the exact measurements of the area that needed to be removed. I then used my pocket square to line up all of the 8 legs that would need this same measurement. In order to remove the amount of wood for this dado, I had to set a stop on the saw so the blade isn't able to go any deeper than I want it to. I adjusted several times until it was perfect. I then lock an extra block behind the piece I'm cutting to give me a clean pass-through. If you're wondering why I'm doing this, it's because I need a square joint, and the blade is round, which means that if I don't pass all the way through the piece of wood, then I will get a slightly rounded curve, which will make things difficult later. Now begins the very long process of slowly removing several inches from the lumber, one pass at a time. You may also notice that this lumber has not been milled, and therefore it is not perfectly square, which means the piece is not lying flat in front of the miter saw. So I have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that this is always oriented the same way every time I cut. Now that I have all the pieces, it's time to assemble my 2 side tables. After clamping 2 of the legs in place, I used 3-inch deck screws to attach the shelf. Of course, the 4th leg needed a little bit of extra motivation to get into place. After making sure the legs were level, I put the top on. I then repeated the whole process a second time. You can see here just how messy the shop gets when any basic level of woodworking occurs. The floor is covered in sawdust, as is every surface. And you can see the shop here is totally incomplete, as this is the first thing I needed to build in order to get the place to function properly. Now that the tables are ready for assemble, it's time to clean up the entire space and make room for my miter saw station. You can even see the dust collecting in the air as I sand these surfaces. Once everything was level and measured out correctly, I attached the piece that holds the miter saw. These 4 holes are for the bolts that will keep the saw in place. For the dust hood, I am using 1/2-inch MDF because it's light and I have a lot of it. I wanted to build an angled bottom for all the remaining dust to funnel out through. They sell these angled channels at Rockler that you just screw onto the bottom and it would have been perfect. For some reason, I thought instead of spending $30, I could just build one myself. However, this turned out to be far more tedious and unnecessary, and it took much longer than it should have. So my advice is to just purchase the ones from Rockler for $30 and save yourself this hassle. Now that I've built my funnel dust collection system, it's time to assemble all of the pieces. Using a perfectly flat 2x4, I make sure that the miter saw is in the right orientation at all times. I then use my new miter saw station to cut some guide fences for longer pieces. Getting everything perfectly aligned here was a pretty interesting challenge. I started by using my perfect 2x4 and locking it to the miter saw. I then clamped the guides to the 2x4s and make sure everything was perfectly measured and perfectly square at all times. And then, of course, I used my pocket jig to put some pocket screws on the other side of the guide. Now this miter saw station isn't just going to be for the miter saw. On either side of it, I'm going to have a bandsaw and a belt sander, and I'm going to need dust collection for those as well. I got this handy splitter and some 2-inch hose, and I'm attaching it here to my 4-inch port so that my entire dust collection system only needs one hose connection. After all of the hoses were in place, it was time to make a track system for some sliding doors for the dust hood. This was pretty easy to do, and I had a bunch of MDF scraps lying around, so I cut them to size and glued them in an L shape. Once I knew the sliding door worked, I nailed the track in place. And I put some cute little handles on the sliding doors as well. This is my miter saw station, and I built this structure in my old shop. It was built for that shop, and since then I've moved into a new location, and I found that it was easier to just move this entire piece of furniture than to take it apart and have to reassemble it, because frankly building this thing was a huge pain. But since we got into the new space, to be completely honest, this has not cut so well. The alignment has never been back to normal. Unfortunately, my new project, the shelves that I'm building, have revealed to me that the miter saw needs a tune-up badly. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to tune this machine up so that we can get it back to perfect square working order. No matter what, we're going to have to realign all of this stuff and get this thing straight. The first thing you want to do is mark your board with 2 arrows and cut right between it. After you're cut, flip the board on the right and it should reveal to you which way your blade is leaning. If there's a gap at the bottom, that means the blade needs to be adjusted. My blade is slightly angled diagonally toward the left bottom. By adjusting the blade to the left, it should straighten things out a little bit. I'm now going to do the test again and check my adjustment. Clearly, it wasn't enough to make much of a difference, as you can really see the gap now. Underneath the saw is an Allen key that will adjust your saw more precisely. I make the cut again, and adjust slightly again, cutting closer each time, and it appears that I now have a perfect 90-degree cut. I then lock my adjustments in place and readjust my 0 gauge. Using a pocket square, I set one side right up against the blade and see if there's any wiggle room up against the fence. It appears there is a little bit of wiggle room, so this needs to be adjusted as well. Adjusting the fence is as easy as loosening the Allen screws behind it and rotating it until it's at 90 degrees. Don't forget to loosen the other side because the fence is on one large swivel. Once you've got it in place, tighten the screws. Time for one more test. And it looks pretty good. Finally, I will test my 45-degree angle, and I'll do this by setting a stop block and cutting 4 identical pieces to make a frame. In this case, the 45-degree angle looks good. And now, my miter saw station is back to perfect alignment, and I can finally keep working. Thanks for watching, and if you have some time, go and check out my other videos.